All right, hello everybody. This is going to be the reading group on Capital Volume 1, Chapter 1. We're only, at least I intend to only lead this to the end of Chapter 1 because Chapter 1 is considerably the hardest of all the chapters because it's the only chapter where Marx really uses a dialectical form for the argument. Nowhere else does it really continue in this way. To the extent that it is used in this chapter. So this is I didn't know this when I first read Capital, but apparently quite a bit of people recommend that you skip chapter 1 and read it long after you've already finished the rest of the book. Which seems strange to me because chapter 1 is just so foundational. If you don't get the stuff in chapter 1, a lot of the stuff that comes on later, it does make sense, but it doesn't make full systematic sense. So it's actually a very important chapter to understand. It's a chapter where the method, you have to really grasp the method of what Marx thinks makes this attempt at considering economic science more scientific than past attempts. It also basically is the clincher for the idea that you cannot possibly have a commodity economy for socialism or communism. So, with that said, we'll start reading. I'm reading from the Samuel Moore and Edward Aveling translation, which is available on Marxist.org. So everybody can hear me fine? No audio issues?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So Chapter 1, Commodities. Section 1, the two factors of a commodity, use value and value, the substance of value and the magnitude of value. Important distinction. I'll try to harp on important distinctions when they come up. The wealth of those societies in which the capitalist mode of production prevails presents itself as an immense accumulation of commodities, its unit being a single commodity. Our investigation must therefore begin with the analysis of a commodity. A commodity is, in the first place, an object outside us, a thing that by its properties satisfies human wants of some sort or another. The nature of such wants, whether for instance they spring from the stomach or from fancy, makes no difference. Neither are we here concerned to know how the objects satisfy these wants, whether directly as means of subsistence or indirectly as means of production. Every useful thing, as iron, paper, etc., may be looked at from 2 points of view of quality and quantity. It is an assemblage of many properties, and may therefore be of use in various ways. To discover the various uses of things is the work of history. So also is the establishment of socially recognized standards of measure for the quantities of these useful objects. The diversity of these measures has its origin partly in the diverse nature of the objects to be measured, partly in convention. And convention, by the way, just means whatever people agree to. Whatever has become the norm by agreement. So, pretty clear up to now. The utility of a thing makes it a use value, but this utility is not a thing of air. Being limited by the physical properties of the commodity, it has no existence apart from that commodity. A commodity such as iron, corn, or a diamond is therefore, so far as it is a material thing, a use value, something useful. This property of a commodity is independent of the amount of labor required to appropriate its useful qualities. When treating of use value, we always assume to be dealing with definite quantities such as dozens of watches, yards of linen, or tons of iron. The use of values of commodities furnish the material for a special study, that of the commercial knowledge of commodities. Use values become a reality only by use or consumption. They also constitute the substance of all wealth, whatever may be the social form of that wealth. In the form of society we are about to consider, they are, in addition, the material depositories of exchange value.
What does he mean by it only becomes reality by consumption? Aren't there commodities that aren't consumed in their use?
No, he says that to have a use value is to be consumed, but that's not to be understood as in a physical consumption.
Yeah.
For example, you
Doesn't
have a
have to be
trophy. The use of that trophy, its consumption is literally for it to sit there and be seen by people.
Yep.
And that use
Okay.
is infinitely longer than your very own life and probably generations of lives, before the thing materially deteriorates and just wears out.
But it doesn't have to wear out. It can be.
Yeah. So long as
Okay.
it's consumption is just that use. So it's not a physical consumption of just getting
So is he
like
saying
eating
use
things.
value is using it?
Yeah.
What does consumption play into it?
Just it's the use. To use it
Okay.
is to consume it. To consume it is to use it.
Consume its worth, really.
Okay.
If we want to think about it metaphysically. Like a thing has worth, and then you consume its use, like however it makes you feel, or whatever.
Yeah, there will be a lot of
If it's a
interesting
trope.
things that will come up with it. I'll talk about it. I can be. You're very low, Hyperion.
Oh, am I? Sorry.
Yeah, I can hear you fine, but you sound low. So, anyways,
Is this better?
let's go on. No, it's still the same. So let's continue. Exchange value, at first sight, presents itself as a quantitative relation, as the proportion in which values in use of one sort are exchanged for those of another sort, a relation constantly changing with time and place. Hence, exchange value appears to be something accidental and purely relative, and consequently an intrinsic value, that is, an exchange value that is inseparably connected with, inherent in commodities, seems a contradiction in terms. Let us consider the matter a little more closely. A given commodity, for example, a quarter of wheat, is exchanged for X blacking, Y silk, and Z gold, etc. In short, for other commodities in the most different proportions. Instead of one exchange value, the wheat has, therefore, a great many. But since X blacking, Y silk, or Z gold, etc., each represents the exchange value of one quarter of wheat, X blacking, Y silk, Z gold, and here we see Marx's autism of just repeating things and why things get so long. Must, as exchange values, be replaceable by each other or equal to each other. Therefore, first, the valid exchange values of a given commodity express something equal. Secondly, exchange value generally is only the mode of expression, the phenomenal form of something contained in it, yet distinguished from it. So here we see a dialectical move. You have exchange values, you're exchanging a quarter of wheat for whatever else, X, Y, Z. And each X, Y, Z will be a different ratio compared to that quarter of wheat. It's 1X, 2 Z's, 3 Y's, whatever. Each is different. The question then comes up, well, one thing remains the same, and that's the quarter of wheat. Something within the quarter of wheat must be the same in all those things, despite their different quantities of exchange. So something must be equal between 1 quarter of wheat and, a pound of apples or something. One thing must be the same between a quarter of wheat and, a bag of nickels or something. Something must be equalizing between both of them. So that's an implicit relation. That's something that you do within dialectical investigations. You look at what is implicit in things, and you go into that and find what unifies them.
So it's exchange value that unifies them?
Here it will be value which unifies exchange values, as well as use values. But Marx won't really go on about use values, but I'll bring it up if it's important. I think it's important. So you have exchange value, which is a quarter of wheat for X, Y, Z, whatever number they are. That's the exchange value as already given. Quarter of wheat is an orange, quarter of wheat is 2 shoes, whatever. Each time it's different because you're exchanging different things. But something is equal within all those different things. That is the implicit relation.
There's one measurement, is what he's saying,
Yeah.
I guess.
Yeah, there's something that must be making them equal, and it can't be their use values because a quarter of wheat is not a bunch of apples. So, their quality cannot be, at least that quality as a use value cannot be what's equalizing them. It can't be what's being compared in them.
Right, thanks.
So continuing, let us take 2 commodities, for example, corn and iron. The proportions in which they are exchangeable, whatever those proportions may be, can always be represented by an equation in which a given quantity of corn is equated to some quantity of iron. For example, 1/4 of corn equals X quantity of iron. What does this equation tell us? It tells us that in 2 different things, in 1/4 of corn and X quarter quantity of iron, there exists in equal quantities something common to both. The 2 things must therefore be equal to a third, which in itself is neither the one nor the other. Each of them, so far as its exchange value, must therefore be reducible to this third. A simple geometrical illustration will make this clear. In order to calculate and compare the areas of rectilinear figures, we decompose them into triangles, but the area of the triangle itself is expressed by something totally different from its visible figure, namely by half the product of the base multiplied by the altitude. In the same way, the exchange values of commodities must be capable of being expressed in terms of something common to them all, of which thing they represent a greater or lesser quantity. I have to say that has to be a terrible example because most people just won't fucking understand that.
I understood it, to be honest.
Oh, that's good.
Am I still low?
Yes.
Damn it. I don't know what to do.
I don't know, talk louder.
Okay.
That sounds more like I have you maxed out on Discord too, so I don't know
Alright.
what the issue is. Check your actual mic volumes on your computer, see if that's set low or
Alright.
something. But anyways, continuing, this common something cannot be either a geometrical, a chemical, or any other natural property of commodities. Such properties claim our attention only insofar as they affect the unity of those commodities, make them use values. But the exchange of commodities is evidently an act characterized by a total abstraction from use value. Then one use value is just as good as another, provided only it be present in sufficient quantity. Or, as old Barbin says, quote, one sort of wares are as good as another, if the values be equal. There is no difference or distinction in things of equal value. An 100 pounds worth of lead or iron is as great value as 100 pounds worth of silver or gold. End quote. As use values, commodities are, above all, of different qualities, but as exchange values, they are merely different quantities, and consequently do not contain an atom of use values. So, there's something I came to notice on this, like over the last, 4 months, I think, though, it suddenly dawned on me that this is not true, in fact, when Marx says this. And I think he realizes this because there's portions in the text later on in this chapter where he will reverse himself on this and admit that exchange value and use value are not really incommensurable things. It's not the case that you can only have a use value at a certain point and exchange value at another. And that to have exchange value is not to have a use value, or to have a use value is not to have an exchange value. And this is a point that comes about because of dialectics. Use value is literally, anything that's useful to you, anything has utility. Marx here takes it as the use value of the object as consumable, but this does not have to be the case. For example, to have something that's not useful to you as a consumable, yet nonetheless useful to you as an exchangeable object, literally as a commodity, is precisely what commodities are. Commodities are things that are useful insofar as they are exchangeable.
Yep.
So to have exchange value is for a commodity to be a use value. To its use value as a commodity is nothing but its exchange value. If that makes any sense to you.
Yeah, it
So,
has use value for others. Am I loud?
Yeah, I can hear you. I mean, like it's just that you sound low. That's the thing.
That's weird. I don't know what to do. I checked everything. Everything seems fine.
Yeah, I don't know. It's fine though.
Smuggle subjective value? Well, I mean, use value is subjective value. It's subjectively useful for the person. And exchange value is, well, it's not objective value, but it's use value for another person. So it's another
Yeah,
subjective value.
yeah. There is no smuggling here. I mean, Marx is very clear. Use value is utility. As a matter of fact, I think, is it in chapter 5? I think there's a couple pages where he actually
Yeah.
makes fun of utilitarian theories of value, in which he says, obviously, but yes, use value is use value subsumes all the subjective forms of value. So it subsumes utility, it subsumes anything else of that sort.
You can use it for other people.
Yeah, it doesn't have
But-
to be a physical use value. Like said
Yeah.
earlier, use value is literally anything that satisfies you, anything at all. So it is it is subjective utility. You know, maybe having a statue of like Donald Trump like gets you off. That's its use value to you. That's its utility. Therefore, it has
Good guy.
a value of that sort. So yeah, it can be anything. There is no smuggling here. Marx is very open about it. This is what otherwise people would call utility nowadays in value theory.
And if he has a problem with that, then I don't know what to tell you.
Yeah. So
from what I
mean-
understand,
yeah, go on.
from what I understand, he's saying that is that all commodities have.
Have what?
All commodities have a use value and an exchange value. Unless,
Well, no, they're actually
Well,
yeah. There is no
yeah,
unless.
they all have an
Every commodity, by
yeah.
fact that it is commodity, is a use value for me as exchangeable and a use value for somebody else, either as also exchangeable or as consumable.
Yeah, and it's only a commodity if it has exchange value. Like if you just make it and you use it, it's not a commodity.
Yeah, and this is a point that's very confusing because Marx himself is not very clear on this, that use value, as he originally puts it, as consumable for me, seems to be completely disconnected from sociality whatsoever, from all sociality. So you can have use values all alone with no society out in the middle of the woods. You know, it's like, oh, this stick is useful for me. You know, that mango is useful for me, whatever. But that's not what use value can mean here in concerning the sociality of a commodity. A use value has to be in relation of me and others. So by being useful to me, it's also in relation that I'm not going to relinquish it to others. By being useful to others, it's also in the case of, well, it's not going to be something that I'm going to consume. And a commodity brings them together as a complete unit in which things can be useful to me by being useful to others, despite having no direct consumable use to me as the object itself. But it can be of direct useful consumability to me as exchangeable. You know, I consume a commodity as commodity by exchanging it for another commodity. That is the consumption of a commodity. It's think about it. The place in which this is most evident is money. You consume money by buying things, by exchanging money for other things. So think about it that way.
Money is consumed.
Yeah.
By that way. Yeah. I think it's like confusing to say you consume money because people think of consumption
yeah.
as eating and things. Yeah, money is consumed in that way.
So is that clear more or less? Did I confuse things?
And it.
If you don't understand something, anyone, don't be shy. We're all here to learn and teach and shit, so don't feel bad if you don't get it. Just ask questions until we elaborate or, we tease it out. As a group, we don't know everything.
Yeah, I learned things.
Yeah.
So no questions. Move on. Yes, no.
If that's
People I don't remind, say yes or no. Somebody.
yes.
All right. All right. Continuing, as use values, commodities are above all of different qualities, but as exchange values they are merely different quantities, and consequently do not contain an atom of use value. So restating that. And I mean, I'll try not to go on those tangents of like the dialectics of it, because boy, that could just go on in circles forever. If then we leave out of consideration the use value of commodities, they have only one common property left, that of being products of labor. But even the product of labor itself has undergone a change in our hands. If we make abstraction from its use values, we make abstraction at the same time from the material elements and shapes that make the product a use value. We see in it no longer a stable, a house, yarn, or any other useful thing. Its existence as a material thing is put out of sight. Neither can it any longer be regarded as a product of the labor of the joiner, the mason, the spinner, or of any other definite kind of productive labor. Along with the useful qualities of the products themselves, we put out of sight both the useful character of the various kinds of labor embodied in them, and the concrete forms of that labor. There is nothing left but what is common to them all. All are reduced to one and the same sort of labor, human labor in the abstract. So here's the beginning of the famous labor theory of value, or at least his version of labor theory of value. And I'm just, I think this is important. Like you have to realize this, that this is false. When he says that the universal thing which all commodities share is that they are all products of labor, is empirically and theoretically false. We know that because of things like ownership of land, where land has value despite not being a product of labor. We know this because you can just go and pick a fucking apple off a tree and sell it despite having done no labor.
We know that you can find a megalodon tooth.
Yeah, I mean, there's, and so people will go on and go to great lengths to try to deny that this is not the case, and they'll say, well, look, within, you walking to that apple tree and, climbing up or whatever, that's labor.
Yeah.
You finding it, that's labor.
But and it's not labor in the Marxist sense.
Yeah, and it just becomes very ridiculous in that literally everything becomes labor, even despite the fact that it wasn't intended as a labor. It wasn't done as a labor, really. I mean, you were just walking around, you found a diamond. The value of that diamond, if all diamonds were found that way, it would have value only insofar as there was somebody actually specifically trying to look for these things, on purpose, and then has an average of finding out, oh, look, this is how much rarity it has according to how much time it takes. But that doesn't happen with a lot of things. A lot of things are commodities simply because people own them. The universal aspect of commodities, one, they're owned, so they are property, and two, they're useful to others and therefore exchangeable.
Karl Marx asked a question. Oh, sorry, go on. He asked a question about
in the Critique of the Gotenberger, he says nature is also a source of wealth, of use values, not just human labor. But that doesn't deny what he says here about value. He's saying value specifically, not use values, but value is specifically connected to exchange value, which is specifically connected to products of labor. In the contribution to the critique of political economy, he explains the process by which he thinks he came up with this conclusion that labor is the universal third thing of all commodities, and it's basically a more expansive version of just saying everything is product of labor, at least everything that's a commodity. But that's obviously not true either. It just isn't. The only thing that things need to be commodities is they need to be owned. They need to have no consumable use as the object for you, other than to be exchanged because they are useful for someone else. But let's take up his assumption here and let's just roll with it, despite the fact that it is just very easily deniable as it's false. But it won't bother much of anything he'll go on about this. The denial of the labor theory of value just really isn't as it doesn't have as many effects as it doesn't have as many effects in the theory as you would think it does.
Yeah, it's just like an artistic point that we discovered more so than anything.
So, continuing. Let us now consider the residue of each of these products. It consists of the same unsubstantial reality in each, a mere congelation of homogeneous human labor, of labor power expended without regard to the mode of its expenditure. All that these things now tell us is that human labor power has been expended in their production, and that human labor is embodied in them. When looked at as crystals of the social substance common to them all, they are values. So things are values insofar as they are products of labor. They are congealed labor in that we could say that in making things, like in making a chair, the entire process of making that chair is embodied in the final product. So you can say that that whole process of labor, the actualization of labor power, is contained in that final product as the completed result. That not too strange a thing to say, really. I mean, it makes sense.
Yeah, even the labor done to produce dead labor, or I guess the means of production, even that is a part of the final product.
Yeah, because that too is those two are products of labor.
Yeah.
So we have seen that when commodities are exchanged, their exchange value manifests itself as something totally independent of their use value. But if we abstract from their use value, there remains their value as defined above. Therefore, the common substance that manifests itself in the exchange value of commodities whenever they are exchanged is their value. The progress of our investigation will show that exchange value is the only form in which the value of commodities can manifest itself or be expressed. For the present, however, we have to consider the nature of value independently of this, its form. Here I have a bit of a problem with this because I don't think this is true. I think that this, and I think Marx knows this as well, and he's saying this here just for expediency's sake. But value cannot simply manifest in exchange value. It must manifest as use values too, because that's exactly what's being exchanged. That you cannot have a commodity that isn't a use value. It's impossible. Otherwise, it wouldn't be exchanged at all. And it can't be the same use values either. It must be a plurality of many use values, many different qualities. Because, you're not going to be trading an apple for an apple. Otherwise, why bother? You're going to be trading different things for different things. And you're going to be exchanging different things at different quantities because that's the nature of the relationship of different qualities. So I think it's a pedantic point, but I also think, it's very important to note that this isn't quite true. That, value really does express itself in the use value and exchange value of commodities both necessarily. You can't really split them. Value does not function in this one-sided way. Because when you finally think, this is going into the overarching system, when you finally think about how the overarching system of capital will work, part of it is it's very interested in use values. It doesn't, there is no disinterest of what people desire. What is produced, what exchange values manifest as products is very much something that capital cares a lot about. Marketing is huge on this. Market research is huge on this. They very much care about what it must manifest. You can't just produce money, because if the use value was of no consequence, then money would be all that markets were about. People would just be exchanging money for money. Pure exchange value with no use value other than exchange value, no other consumptive value. But that's not the case. Half of the economy, or the real economy, has to be based around the real objects, real use values. So value must manifest as use values.
I'm not entirely sure what value on its own is without use or exchange.
It isn't anything. Marx here obviously is saying he's going to say it's abstract, socially necessary abstract labor time. But at this point, logically speaking, if we were trying to do a dialectics like Hegel does, which is what Marx is trying to do, you can't say that. You can say that value is the universal which unifies them and which manifests in them. What value in itself is precisely, which is your question, is really nothing at this point. Value, I actually have a blog I wrote this. It's mostly done, but I just haven't bothered to finish it, in which I go into this question because it was interesting to me. In which, why is it called value in the first place? What are the kind of things that, well, what do we mean by value in normal days? Well, things that we desire, things that we like, things that are meaningful to us. We have values like morals. We say moral values. Those things that, we find desirable. We say we value our friends. We find them desirable. We think they have intrinsic worth to us as desirable. We think they're worth keeping around. We want to preserve them. We say we have commodities have values, and that's the amount of money, the quantity of money or whatever. Why? Because we desire it. So value is something that is intrinsically tied to desire. But the way that value works in economics is it's literally a pure desire manifests as no specific thing. But that's going into points which are going off topic here. But don't worry too much about what value in itself really is, because the truth is value in itself is not anything. Value is only what value manifests as. Value is use values. Value is exchange value. Value is money. Value is capital. Value is labor. Like the truth of what value is what value will manifest as.
Right, I think I get it.
So continuing, a use value or useful article, therefore, has value only because human labor in the abstract has been embodied or materialized in it. How then is the magnitude of this value to be measured? Plainly by the quantity of the value creating substance, the labor containing the article. The quantity of labor, however, is measured by its duration, labor time, in its turn, finds its standard in weeks, days, and hours. So here, when one begins, it's very easy to fall into this trap of just like, oh, Marx is really this really smart, brilliant guy. Wow, I never thought about these things, and I felt that way when I first read this. In which, you just take his word for it, and you don't really think about it. And I think that's fine. I think that's really how you learn. You have to really get into it and go with it all the way. But here I have to point out too, this is false. When he says that things are valuable because they're products of human labor, that's just not true. And the point about the critique of the Gotha program is precisely a point against this claim, that nature creates use values too. Nature creates things that we desire. So the things that we desire and we find valuable are not just things that are products of human labor. Of course, here he's trying to speak more so on the side of exchange values, that, that what we find desirable in exchange values is human labor. But that too is sort of a stretch, in which, you will say, yes, I value the apple that was grown on the tree, which was naturally there. But, the reason I'm exchanging anything at all with this other person who picked this apple, just happened to walk by and picked it, and, I have banana, they want a banana, and I want their apple. The reason I'm exchanging for this is because, what I'm recognizing there is their human labor. And if you think about it that way, that makes sense. I think that makes a lot of sense.
Maybe you can think about it in the Lyshenkoist way. Maybe trees are workers.
Yeah, there's a way to think about that too. But I mean, here it's a pedantic point, but it's an important point in which, yeah, if what you think that a person will, if the gate is an acknowledgement of human labor, then, that makes sense. Somebody will say, why should I give you this apple? Yeah, I just walked by and picked it. I didn't do anything for it. It was just there. But, I had to walk by it, I had to pick it, and, it's like, so you got to give me something, equivalent to that effort that I put in, or whatever. But that's not necessarily the case, really. When you have just abstract commodities, not yet in a generalized market in which you have this ground floor of socially necessary labor time, how do you quantify, this generalized labor that people do of just walking around and noticing things and picking up and say, well, that's mine now, and then you're exchanging them? You don't know how long, some stranger comes from some other village, you don't know how long they actually walked around to pick up that apple. They could have been like literally, they just walked outside and it was right there. It could have been, they had to they knew there was an apple tree down in the middle of the woods, so they had to go, take a 30-minute detour or something. You don't know that. So, how do you end up gauging what that really is? Well, you end up just bartering of, haggling. You start a guessing game of how much are they really willing to give up? How much is it really worth it to them, and how much is it really worth it to me? And that it really is, you can talk about that as that is some sort of approximation towards a content of labor, but I think that's just kind of nonsense, really. When you're haggling those kinds of things in the abstract, what are you really haggling for? Well, just basically going towards exactly what the utilitarian, marginal utilitarians talk about, which is you're getting at some point at which, do I really want this or do you really not? So how badly do I want it? How badly do they want what I have? And it's not really representative of any amount of labor that's been going on. It's like, for example, it could take you a long time to raise a chicken, but maybe I'm not really a fan of chicken. So, in the abstract, you really want my apples, but I don't really want your chickens, You're going to have to give me a lot more chickens for my apple than, I'm willing to give my apple for your chickens. So, it might, whether it takes you, obviously, really a lot more labor to raise that chicken than it took me to pick that apple, it doesn't matter to me. I don't care. I don't have to be recognized.
Doesn't he go over this in the thing up top about X blackening, Y silk, Z gold? It doesn't matter how much you like chicken because chicken can be exchanged.
Mm-hmm.
Well, yeah, but it does matter how much you like chicken in the abstract, because that's the only thing that's actually being measured. You don't have to care about the guy who's trying to trade the chicken, because if you don't want the chicken as much as they want your apple, it doesn't matter how much labor they put into the chicken, how much labor it takes. If I'm not willing to exchange it for whatever it is they think is fair, it's just not going to happen. And that's that. You may think... So my point is, in the abstract, without a generalized commodity economy yet, this point is not true. Because I don't have to care about how much labor you put into things. Because we don't have to treat of things as if they are... We're trading products in which we're gauging how much work we put into it. We're also gauging how much we want things, how much we're willing to give for things, regardless of how much labor it takes for us or for them. It's actually, this is a big point about the mud pies. What is it about mud pies? Well, they're made So it's not just that labor was done. That's not just what we recognize. And suppose somebody really did want mud pies. Even then, they don't have to recognize how much labor you have to put in. You put in 10 hours of labor on mud, making mud pies. Well, great. I like mud pies, but I'm only going to give you, like 10 minutes worth of labor for that. What are you going to do about it? Are you going to say, well, you're cheating me? I've made 10 hours of worth of labor of mud pies. It doesn't really work that way. There is an importance to subjective valuation and use value that it goes on with an exchange. It becomes even more important the more primitive the economy is. When you have just this abstract, not yet capitalist, generalized commodity production economy, there is the whole idea that people are comparing labor time doesn't work. Like, it becomes a lot more and more subjective, because that's just kind of really how it is. Nobody is doing these things for the sake of maximizing production. Nobody's doing these things for meeting a quota. People just happen to trade things. So, the big point I want to make there is just don't fall too much for these abstractions, because they are abstractions that Marx is making, and he's trying to bring in considerations which cannot yet be brought in. In a generalized commodity exchange of the modern economy, it makes a lot more sense to be talking about the exchange of things being almost wholly determined by their labor content, their socially necessary labor time. But in this point of just abstract commodity exchange, not yet. Or, what people would call primitive commodity exchange. Continuing. Some people might think that if the value of a commodity is determined by the quantity of labor spent on it, the more idle and unskilled the labor, the more valuable would his commodity be, because more time would be required in its production. The labor, however, that forms the substance of value is homogeneous human labor, expenditure of one uniform labor power. The total labor power of society, which is embodied in the sum total of the values of all commodities produced by that society, counts here as one homogeneous mass of human labor power, composed, though it be, of innumerable individual units. Each of these units is the same as any other, so far as it has the character of the average labor power of society, and takes effect as such. That is, so far as it requires for producing a commodity no more time than is needed on an average, no more than is socially necessary. The labor time socially necessary is that required to produce an article under normal conditions of production and with the average degree of skill and intensity prevalent at the time. The introduction of power looms into England probably reduced by 1/2 the labor required to weave a given quantity of yarn into cloth. The handloom weavers, as a matter of fact, continue to require the same time as before, but for all that, the product of 1 hour of their labor represented after the change only half an hour's social labor, and consequently fell to 1/2 of its former value. We see then that which determines the magnitude of the value of any article is the amount of labor socially necessary, or the labor time socially necessary for its production. Each individual commodity in this connection is to be considered as an average sample of its class. Commodities, therefore, in which equal quantities of labor are embodied, or which can be produced in the same time, have the same value. The value of one commodity is to the value of any other, as the labor time necessary for the production of the one is to the necessary for the production of the other. As values, all commodities are only definite masses of congealed labor time. So it's simple enough. Here he brings in socially necessary labor time, talking about, it's like, well, it doesn't matter. It does matter, that there's a social average. He's trying to bring in sociality into the picture now. He's saying, it's not just your own private labors that counts. It's your private labor related to the private labors of other people, made into an average, and then that's what really sets the value as such. So, you take 10 hours to make a shirt, but, the rest of society on average takes about 5 hours. You're not going to be able to charge for 10 hours worth of labor. You're only going to be able to be charged for 5. So, you're not efficient, and if that sale that you make is not enough to cover, your own costs of living, your own costs of productions, well, you're not going to be in that business for very long. So, pretty clear stuff, I think. The value of a commodity would therefore remain constant if the labor time required for its production also remained constant, but the latter changes with every variation in the productiveness of labor. This productiveness is determined by various circumstances, amongst other by the average amount of skill of the workman, the state of science, and the degree of its practical application, the social organization of production, the extent of capabilities of means of production, and by physical conditions. For example, the same amount of labor in favorable seasons is embodied in 8 bushels of corn, in unfavorable in only 4. The same labor extracts from rich mines more metal than poor from poor mines. Diamonds are of very rare occurrence on the Earth's surface, and hence their discovery costs, on average, are a great deal of labor time. Consequently, much labor is represented in small compass. Jacob doubts whether gold has ever been paid for at its full value. This applies still more to diamonds. According to Eschwege, the total produce of the Brazilian diamond mines for the 80 years ending in 1823 had not realized the price of 1.5 years of average produce of the sugar and of coffee plantations of the same country, although the diamonds cost much more labor and therefore represented more value. That's interesting.
Hey, Josh. It's cool.
Hello, hello, hello. People see me?
Yeah.
Okay.
We're just we're not that far in, Josh.
Alright, continuing. With richer mines, the same quantity of labor would embody itself in more diamonds, and their value would fall. Or, you could have a monopoly like De Beers, and know that diamonds are literally like as common as fucking dirt, but just hoard them and have very good marketing.
Yeah.
Which, by the way, is one of the things which shows that Marx's assumption here is not quite true, even though a lot of people will then argue, wait, in the perfect conditions of the market, this would be true, and in that case, yeah. But also then, one can't imagine the perfect conditions of the market in which, this is the De Beers situation is legitimately the case, merely because of the way private property works. So, it could still happen that labor time is not the decisive factor of the value of things. Continuing, if we could succeed at a small expenditure of labor in converting carbon to diamonds, the value might fall below that of bricks. It already should have, and we already do that. Which, by the way, just goes to show you, like, use value is important, like, very important. We can mass produce diamonds, literally manufacture them, despite the fact that they're already naturally just worthless because they're as common as dirt. But we can even manufacture them. But those aren't popular. Why? Because people say, oh, well, they're not natural. They're not the real thing, the real thing. A totally subjective valuation, which has nothing to do with the actual object itself. It's a fucking diamond. And yet, people will value the natural thing above the manufactured thing, despite being the same objective material kind of thing. And this is a real valuation. It increases the real value of diamonds, which is, completely stupid. But hey, that just goes to show you, use value, very important for commodities. What people want things for and what they see the value in things for is very important. It can't be discounted as part of the determining factor of the value of things themselves. I mean, one of the things that you could make an example of, it's like art, some no-name nowadays could paint the Da Vinci, just replicate the Mona Lisa, pretty almost near flawlessly. But will people like pay for their replication like they will pay for like the actual original thing? And no. And part of it is people say, well, it's a rare thing. Well, its rarity is not just that the object as a material object is a rarity. No, the rarity is that there's only one Mona Lisa that was painted by Da Vinci. And what people value in that is it was painted by Da Vinci. And what the labor of Da Vinci is not quantifiable. Da Vinci wasn't a product of anything. I mean, literally what people just like it's Da Vinci. It doesn't matter how much labor it actually took to make Da Vinci. If you counted all the resources he consumed along his life, intellectual and material, you still, even if you replicated that, you still couldn't get the value of Da Vinci. So continuing, in general, the greater the productiveness of labor, the less is the labor time required for the production of an article, the less is the amount of labor crystallized in that article, and the less is its value. And vice versa, the less the productiveness of labor, the greater is the labor time required for the production of an article, and the greater is its value. Of course, we know that, always keep in mind, as the things I was saying, the use value matters, because otherwise the mud pie argument can be made.
Doesn't Marx make the distinction between individual and social labor somewhere?
Yeah, it comes up later. It's mainly just done to get rid of that, the whole thing. But the weird thing is, I mean, the way he gets rid of that is to subsume use value within socially necessary labor time, such that socially necessary labor time is not just purely labor time. It is useful labor time. It is desirable labor time. So it's not labor time itself, then, that is implicitly what is valuable in and for itself. It's labor time that is desired, which is valuable. Which brings to question his claim that it's labor time as such that determines the value of things. So in that sense, there I would say that Marx is actually just sneaking in subjective use value, subjective utility, despite wanting to deny that such things really have a determining power, a factor in the quantity or the magnitude of value. So continuing, a thing can be a use value without having value. This is the case whenever its utility demand is not due to labor. Such are air, virgin soil, natural metals, etc. A thing can be useful in the product of human labor without being a commodity. Whoever directly satisfies his wants with a product of his own labor creates indeed use values, but not commodities. In order to produce the latter, he must not only produce use values, but use values for others, social use values. And not only for others, without more. The medieval peasant produced quit rent corn for his feudal lord, and tithe corn for his parson. But neither the quit rent corn nor the tithe corn became commodities by reason of the fact that they had been produced for others. To become a commodity, a product must be transferred to another, whom it will serve as a use value by means of an exchange. Lastly, nothing can have value without being an object of utility. If the thing is useless, so is the labor contained in it. The labor does not count as labor and therefore creates no value. So here is the first point, which is what you were talking about. Sociality is absolutely important. Labor as labor is not what matters here. Social labor is what matters. And in a commodity, usefulness as usefulness is not what matters. Social usefulness is what matters. So when we talk about the use values of commodities, and here is a point which I've just realized in literally the last week, in which the way that use value and exchange value are opposed, this is a point about dialectics in which things are imminently opposed to each other, necessarily, intrinsically. I mean, just looking at this, the way he talks about use value, how in the world is exchange value a contradiction or the opposite of use value? I can't think of how. You know, you think that the opposite of use value of usefulness. Did I cut off?
No, it's just you're asking how use value and exchange value are a contradiction.
Yeah, because upon this, what he's saying here, obviously, that's not obvious at all. You think that the usefulness of things, the usefulness of things is merely the usefulness to me, the usefulness of things then is just simply the opposite would be not useful to me. But there's no implication there of a usefulness for somebody else.
I don't know. Its usefulness as an exchange value to you is its use as exchange. And
yeah,
its
but that's in a
exchange
commodity.
Is useful for other. Yeah, I know.
Yeah, that's in the commodity. But like, the reason it works in the commodity is because fundamentally there must be a opposition that connects them, not just in a commodity, but in themselves. You know, that the opposite of a use value really must be the use of others for others that is available in exchange value. But when you think about use value as merely utility to me in abstraction without society, nowhere is this obvious.
No abstraction. Yeah. I mean, contradiction.
Yeah, you'd think, well, you know, the opposite of a use value is simply not being a use value. That is, that it's not useful to me. You know?
Yeah. So it's just something you're never going to use.
Yeah, there is no implication there of useful for somebody else. You know, and that's because this is precisely being taken in an abstract sense, that the idea of usefulness comes up without sociality, without a usefulness.
Perhaps it's useful in ways you don't acknowledge. I don't know. I'm trying to think about it more abstractly because I can't think of anything else that's apparent.
Well, no, like what I wanted to say is that this contradiction of use value and exchange value is only a contradiction if both of them are considered socially, where Marx here is not considering them socially. He's saying use value can be just this abstract thing where it's just for me, you know, irrelevant. You know, it's completely separated from a sociality whatsoever. You know, I can be an individual, you know, the Robinson Crusoe, and be talking about, this is useful for me. And, you know, you're not talking nonsense, obviously.
Mm-hmm. You're saying, like, I can use this.
But then that makes a very big distinction about what is implied within the use value of commodities and the use values of just pure utility, where pure utility is not a social thing. Pure utility can be a completely individual thing, whereas use values must be social use values. That by being useful for me, I acknowledge that I'm excluding others from using it. That by being useful for others, I acknowledge that I'm being excluded from the use of it as a consumptive object, you know, the physical object.
What do you guys think? Or
yeah, am I confusing
any
things?
commentary?
You know, if you think I'm just like going off topic here and just confusing things, let me know.
This is my first time reading Capital, so it's just kind of a lot to take in at once.
Yeah, right. So, I mean, that's understandable. But for everybody else, come on, you've got to have some thoughts. Got to have something to say.
You've been a communist for a long time. You got to say something.
Who?
You.
Me?
You've been a communist forever. Yeah.
No, I've been. Well, I've only
for as
been a
long as I've
communist.
known you. Yeah, I know.
Oh, for how long have you known me?
Like a year or two. Well.
Really?
Around a year.
No, you didn't. No, a year or two? Are you kidding? I came to Discord like February.
Okay.
February February this year, yeah.
Yeah. All right. I don't know. Maybe we should just go on. Does everyone understand what Marx is saying, though?
Yeah, so long as you
Yeah.
understand what Marx is saying, it's
Yeah.
good enough. I
You
mean,
don't have to
my
understand our
commentaries.
artistic rambling, I guess.
I
All
mean, he's essentially saying that, not all products produced by labor are commodities. They're only commodities within certain within a context.
Yeah, the context of social desiring. People want it.
Yeah.
So,
Yep.
Yep, the context of use values.
So he's saying that, yeah, these are use value and exchange value are essential, and if one is missing, it isn't a commodity.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, there is a determining factor. Marx thinks that use value is a necessary condition for value. But he doesn't think that it's a determining factor on the quantity of value. I think that is it's empirically wrong, as well as logically wrong. Because we do see empirically psychological, personal factors, personal valuations of use value do factor into how much people really are willing to pay in exchange value. You also have that, logically speaking, that is very much acceptable. It's part of what is expected of the subject, which is a psychological subject, in which, as a free subject, there's nothing that you do that necessitates me having to acknowledge anything about, having, literally having to. There's nothing forcing me to pay you according to a rate around labor. If I don't value your labor's just not worth it to me. That's it.
Yeah.
Or you could be someone with clout and thus demand more for your labor, even though it's not really worth the product itself isn't worth it.
Some guy, like a famous, it's like what you go to a restaurant, the famous chef will cook you a burger. Anybody else could probably cook you a burger, like pretty close, if not, not always the same, as like the big guy. But they're not the big name. So that burger's not going to cost, from the burger from the no name is not going to cost you anywhere close to as the burger from the big name. But the burger from the big name is it's the guy.
There's a couple of things that determine price. One of them is certainly advertising and monopolization of brands, I guess. So that's why Coca-Cola is like so popular, because they have this secret ingredient. Well, what is it? It's nothing. It's just Coca-Cola. That's the secret ingredient. It's the brand.
Well, we don't know. It's in a vault, locked away. It's probably just a piece of paper with nothing on it. That would be great.
It's just the trademark.
Yeah, I mean it's a psychological value. It's like Apple. Apple's sells shit at ridiculous prices because its use value, its image, is the one thing that people really desire, value more. So value, this is not Marx's point, but this is my point against Marx, where you just cannot discount subjective valuation as determining it. You can't. To speak of that's not really as valuable. I know why Marx says it, and I'll talk about it when it comes into light. In which what Marx says makes sense within his system, and it makes a lot of sense. But I don't think it makes sense concerning the real economy. Because, to just give you a bit of outlook on that. I don't know how much longer you guys want to run this for. I mean, we've been going for an hour. We finished a section. That might be good enough for all of you. I mean, I could go on for another hour easy.
Yeah, it's pretty dense. So, I mean, we did 3 pages. That pretty much counts as 100. I'm being hyperbolic, but
It's probably good to do one section per session.
All right. But just to add one last thing, what I was going to say, which is the reason Marx is saying this is because Marx considers the real economy to be the totality of labor actually done. So, all the work that people are doing, that's the real economy. The real objects, the real products, that's the real economy. And all of that is based on, well, the limit of what? Labor time. We can only work so much, and in working so much, we can only produce so much. So when Marx is talking about like what the real value of things is, he's thinking about it in this way: as the economy as a totality of labor. The productive forces, the productive activities, all these things. And subjective valuations only skew the reality of what has been done. So much labor has been spent on so many burgers at McDonald's. So much labor has been spent on so many PlayStations. So much labor has been spent on making chocolate. So much labor has been spent on like teaching. That's what Marx cares about. Like for him, that's the real economy. And that the economy isn't moved. The economy ideally for him is moved by the recognition of this real economy. That ideally things are moved according to how much labor they are within the economy. So one laborer gets to claim only so much as it actually produces. So that's the real value of things. If things really sold at their real values, we would have a rational economy in which labor was accorded to its labor, to its what it actually produces. It would be an actual meritocracy, so to say. You wouldn't be talking about like, oh, that's overpriced, or well, I got scammed, I got underpriced, whatever, or my stuff is not being undersold. That wouldn't happen. But that's not what the real economy is based around. The real economy is based around a lot of psychological whims, psychological individual valuations, which have nothing to do with how much people are spending or using labor, how much they're working.
yeah, that's one of the main 20th century critiques of, I guess, orthodox Marxism, the neglect of psychoanalysis.
Well, we have to acknowledge that it wasn't established as a practice until the late 19th century, after Marx, with Freud, and then it became very widespread only in the 20th century. So
I mean, for Marx, the importance is labor, and Marx thinks labor is obviously one of the most valuable things we have. It's literally our lives. We labor for most of our lives. We labor for almost everything that we have nowadays. In the modern day, really, most things really are products of labor. And the idea for communism is we shouldn't be wasting it. We shouldn't be doing what capital does, in which you can do a lot of labor and it could end up being for nothing. Maybe people don't want it. Maybe literally millions, billions of hours of labor go to waste every year on shit that was produced, which ends up being not sold because nobody wants it. So that's part of what the planned economy ideal of communism is supposed to solve. Albeit my personal opinions on that are like, that seems a silly thing to try to solve, really. You can't force people to recognize every labor as necessary. You can't force people to want every labor. People, a lot of what we do is, a sort of guessing game of, maybe people will like this, maybe people won't. You can't write a novel and say people really want it. In the way, you don't know that until it's being written and it's being put out there.
Yeah, so the value is only, would you say, determined at the market?
Yeah, the value is only known after the fact of it enters the social sphere, and it's either recognized or it's not. And however much it's recognized for,
Yeah.
that's how much people actually wanted it. That's how much value society puts on that thing. Whether you as an individual may think, wow, that's overvalued. Wow, Miley Cyrus is making like $10 million a year or whatever, she doesn't deserve it. Well, that's not a judgment for you to make. That's a judgment for
Yeah.
society to make. And society makes this judgment, and guess what? Society's pretty stupid. So
Yeah, that's what happens when people say, "Oh, that movie's overrated." They think subjectively that the objective societal standard for what the movie is seen as is higher than its actual worth. But they're technically wrong. I mean, in this sense.
Yeah, the movie
But we're all
technically
subjective.
the movie technically did what it's supposed to do, which
Yeah.
appealed to the public.
yep,
We can say Stalker is just a better product than La La Land, but empirically it's false, I guess.
yeah, empirically, people don't value the better product as better. So we'll leave it at that. Hopefully, my ramblings and aside critiques didn't confuse things.
We only lost one person due to that, so
Yeah,
I'd say that's pretty.
he's a reactionary now. He's a
Oh, is he?
fascist.
Oh, gosh.
I don't know. I don't know.
Oh, you don't know who he is? Oh, I thought you knew who he was.
All right, so we'll leave it there. We'll start at section 2 next time. I don't know how often people can do this. But the most open times, obviously, are the weekends for me because I don't work. But if we can do it more often, that'd be fine. So see you next time.
Next time.
Yeah.
But